History shapes everything we do and everything we believe. Across the centuries, a few have written the stories of humanity, and in doing so, have silenced countless others. Choke Points Through Time is where those voices are heard again. Join Dr. Wayne Sedlak, linguist, scholar of ancient languages and history, pastor, former missionary to Africa, graduate school dean, and professor, as he opens the door to our forgotten past. From the tablets of lost civilizations to the chronicles of empires long fallen, discover the truths history tried to hide and the forces that still shape our world today. Choke Points Through Time, a journey through the pivotal moments of mankind's story. This is history as you've never heard it before. And now, here is Dr. Wayne Sedlak.
Well, I'd like to welcome you to yet another episode of Choke Points Through Time. Joseph Stalin was considered one of the cruelest dictators in the history of the world. Lived during the 20th century and is responsible for the rise of communism more than just about anybody else. It was he who ordered the slaughter of 6 million kulaks by his henchmen, men under his authority by the name of Nikita Khrushchev, himself would later become the premier of the Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin was an historian in his own right. Because he was cruel doesn't mean he couldn't understand what made his primary enemy so powerful. Now, you might think that his primary enemy would be the United States, and I guess politically speaking, yes, it's true, but he realized something was deeper when it came to the United States. So, yeah, given that the U.S. at that time was his great enemy, there was something much, much more powerful within the United States, and that was the Church of Christ. Both he and the founder of communism, of the Soviet Union, Vladimir Lenin. In fact, Stalin's the one that had Lenin murdered. They too, along with a fellow named Leon Trotsky, were the ones that brought about the Bolshevik communist revolution that threw Russia into the hands of the communists. Like I said, though, Stalin was the most powerful of the three. He murdered the other two, rose to power, and would last in power another 30 years or so. His knowledge of history is one of his greatest strengths, and it is he who turned to the backbone of the United States in its early inception and saw the Puritans of New England, whom he detested, and yet there was that mixed emotion. He admired them. He is on record as stating that he wished his version of communism could attain, proportionally speaking, the kind of influence that the Puritans created in the world of their day and beyond, and were responsible, in fact, a full century and a half, in laying the foundation for the future United States, again, long before we were a country. Stalin hated the Puritans. Make no mistake about it. Anything like that, any Christianity in his realm, he hunted down. But he also recognized how powerful they are, as the statement I just shared with you shows. More to the point, he warned, well, at that time it's called the NKVD, later become the KGB. The NKVD, or as we know it, the KGB, was pretty much his creation. His genius went to it and gave it its directives. And worldwide, one of those directives was to watch carefully for the rise of anything, and he described the Puritans, their theology, and the law of God, which they embraced and utilized right out of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible called the Pentateuch, and more especially as the Apostle Paul refers to that usage in both Old and New Testament. Anything that would arise that would endorse the law of God, he ordered the NKVD to be careful of, and when it would rise, to do everything it could to smear it, to attack it. In fact, that's exactly what occurred. When authors like Greg Bahnsen, Dr. Van Til, and other great men brought the law of the Lord to the forefront, R.J. Rushdoony writing his biblical law, Greg Bahnsen writing his work using the term theonomy, which has taken on a different connotation than what he intended, but it means theos, God, pneumos, law, God's law. Didn't have the eschatological ensnarements that now accompany it. But when that arose, that emphasis arose in the churches in the 1970s. The KGB, through some of its moles in the media, and through some of its moles, believe it or not, in the seminaries, began to attack it. And they did a pretty good job of slandering it. Why did he fear the Puritan movement? Well, in his own words, Puritanism was and became the backbone of the founding principles that led to the rise of the United States. You see, de Tocqueville, whom Stalin was very much familiar with, would write of the Puritans. In fact, you'll find that beginning as chapter 2, the first chapter is a chapter on geography. I'd recommend you skip it. It's wonderful, but it's hardly worth the read in my estimation when you're looking for something like we're discussing now. Should have put it at the end of the book, maybe as an appendix, but in any event, it was the Puritan movement in New England, specifically New England, Connecticut, Massachusetts Bay Colony, the original Pilgrims, Rhode Island to some extent through Roger Williams, but that's kind of a mixed bag. And then later, the model, the innovations that they established were copied by the other colonies throughout the United States. Well, throughout the colonies that became the United States. Tocqueville draws reference to that genius as all eyes were upon New England. The rise of the New England woman, a woman who was cultured in the churches of New England, the Puritan churches, later dovetailed into the Puritan and Presbyterian influence and affected the Baptist, the Reformed Baptist presence in the northern colonies. All of that kind of gained momentum, creating a common ethic and a common theology, differing on just a few points. Stalin knew that. And despite all of his alleged atheism, we're told by Svetlana, his daughter, as she defected to the United States, she would later go back to Russia, but she described her father, when he was dying, as screaming. As he looked up and he saw, as he described, what he described as his feet entering into hell. He was screaming at the prospect of entering into hell. Shocking, of course, his atheistic comrades that surrounded him. He died in that state, screaming in terror of the eternal hell he believed he was now moving into as a result of his immediate death state as he felt it come upon him. So what about the Puritans and more especially the awe with which they were looked upon by many in the colonies? Well, let's take a look at a couple of passages. First of all, we've spoken of the devil, and in previous episodes, we spoke of the devil with respect to principalities and authorities and spiritual wickedness in high places. Note that. A combination of for high places is a combination of the authorities that rule there and the satanic backing, or shall I say the satanic inspiration, power, even possession they gain from the devil. Paul says in Ephesians 6, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, spiritual wickedness in high places. So the high places is the abode of the devil as he tries to control his kingdom. You know, when he tempted Christ, he took him up and he showed him all the kingdoms of the world. Took him on top of a mountain. Showed him all the kingdoms of the world as in a moment said, all these I'll give you if you just fall down and worship me. Of course, in the law of the Lord, worship is associated with king. And Christ is that king. The Puritans made that point, in fact. One of the reasons why they left England is because the kings at that time, the Stuart kings, it'd be King James, the one who ordered the King James Bible, his son Charles I, then Charles II, Stuart, and then James II. There was 4 of them, all of them diehard enemies of the truth. They lasted through the 1600s. And they were the great enemies, such that they persecuted Puritans. Well, the Puritans, through their churches, were gaining in great power. That power came as a result of their theology. That theology moved the hearts of many 10,000s of people in England. It dovetailed with the Scottish theology of the Presbyterians of the day, Knox's brand of theology, because it's so close to it, differing in only 1 or 2 points, and swept through the British Isles. The people of England noted the impact of these churches and the changes that came with the influence of these churches. And yes, these churches did call for a stand of resistance against tyrants. And because of the churches in England, the great English Bill of Rights would eventually come out. Our Bill of Rights is named for the great English Bill of Rights. It's a Puritan-influenced document. It includes what we call today our Second Amendment, but it includes many other powerful protections against persecuting government. The people of England did recognize that the Puritans had had that kind of an influence. Many people didn't want the religion. They didn't want that kind of worship to bind themselves, but they could recognize its powerful influence. Many of them, the Puritans, first the Pilgrims in particular, which is a brand of Puritanism called the Separatists, and then others came to America, and we have that rise of a civilization. Interestingly enough, since we are talking about the church, and that's really the genius that created the real government of the United States. When I say government, I don't mean the sheriffs and the army and the presidents and all that. I'm talking about that which moved people and governed them in their daily lives and their thinking from Sunday to Sunday through the week. The Bible tells us, to the intent that now under the principalities and powers in heavenly places, or in high places in Ephesians 6, in heavenly places here, might be recognized by the church, the manifold wisdom of God. It's a clumsy translation in the King James, even with a little bit of a modified wording, like recognize instead of known. But the point is that the church is the one that teaches about the spiritual battle and teaches the governing principalities about the heavenly origin of the church and the empowerment of the church. Remember, upon this rock I'll build my church, and gates of hell will not prevail against it. the two are going to collide. Satan's kingdom, ruled through authorities, principalities, rulers of the darkness of this world, are going to collide with the church. Jesus said that in Matthew 16. So they're going to know about each other. They're going to recognize each other. That collision is going to come as the church lays siege to a wicked world by the preaching, the lifestyle, by the authority of the church, and as we testify, martyreo in the Greek, we testify, and God sends in his heavy artillery, his judgments. He waits for us to recognize what they will be from Scripture. Often Deuteronomy 28 comes into play, and then God endorses what we say by doing the very things which those in the pulpit and those that learn it as they sit in the pews and then go out into the world reflect upon, build upon, depend upon, and teach. Martyreo, to testify. I've told the story many times. I'll say it again. We have a great impact upon even the non-believers. De Tocqueville noticed that in America. I illustrated with the story of Ethan Allen. Ethan Allen was an agnostic. He and his Green Mountain Boys. They fought during the War for Independence. Great fighters, by the way. When he took Fort Ticonderoga, a very public event and a prestigious one, when the British officer in charge demanded by what authority Ethan Allen acted, he said, in the name of the great Jehovah, in the Continental Congress. See, even as a non-believer, you recognize that the colonies are pretty much guided by the Lord, as preached in the pulpit. In fact, the British spoke of the War for Independence as, and you already know what I'm going to say, I'm sure, the Presbyterian Revolt. And they grouped Puritans, Congregationalists actually, and the Presbyterians and even the Reformed Baptists, and they grouped many of these together. But the fact is, and you should add some very powerful Lutheran expositors, preachers, ministers, in all of that. Some of those formerly the Anglican Church that rejected what we would call the liberalizing influence and adhered to the historic doctrines of the faith. All these, the British public actually referred to as the Presbyterian influence in America. They made it easy on themselves. They weren't going to make distinctions. Because you see, they're familiar with that in John Knox's Scotland, just to the north of them. They had gone through that as a Reformation 100 years earlier. About that in New England, many of the Puritans came over here, many of the Presbyterians, and they developed a civilization rapidly. In fact, inside of 20 to 25 years, the Pilgrims were so successful that they attracted many, many thousands of immigrants and created the heritage of freedom, coupled with a godly wisdom. I began to say a moment ago, the women of New England were heralded as a different breed of woman, and I meant that in a good sense. Tocqueville writes about the Pilgrim maidens. In fact, if you were to go to near Boston, you would see the park and a statue dedicated to the Pilgrim maidens, the wise counsels of those women. Now, don't get me wrong; they didn't take over and usurp authority over their menfolk, but these girls were not easily moved. They were not easily seduced. In fact, they were a real helpmeet to their husbands. The Indians marveled at these women. They couldn't conquer them. Even if they kidnapped them, they couldn't break them. The Indians spoke of the Pilgrims first, even before they knew who the Pilgrims were. The sachems, that would be the chiefs who were also witch doctors, very much in tune with the spirit world, the occult. All over New England, there was the testimony among the sachems that the real rulers of their lands are soon to arrive. They'll come from the east. They'll settle in our land. The sachems then encourage one another to get along with these people because the supreme being, their word for God, protects and defends them. So when the Pilgrims showed up, they were fearful. They were such a small band of people. And in the first 2 winters, were whittled down in size due to sickness. They figured at any time the Indians would come and take them, but they didn't. Why? Because there was a fear. Because of those sachems and that word of counsel. Squanto, and he was a Pequot Indian, P-E-Q-U-O-T, the Pequot Indians, a fierce and proud tribe, showed up in the camp of the Pilgrims speaking English. In fact, the first thing he said was, "You got any beer?" They were shocked. They found out that he had been kidnapped a few years earlier, taken to first Spain and then to England. While living in England, by the way, didn't live very far from Pocahontas, a woman from Jamestown who had married, became a Christian, moved then to England, where she would live, and that's where she would pass away. Squanto knew who she was. They only lived we would say a couple blocks from each other. In any event, his Christian master, this was common to the slave institutions which the Christians did not create. I'm specific to the historic Protestant position. The Pilgrims loathed slavery, and there's an exception to that, unfortunately. We can deal with that another time. It's not a good exception. It's when they went into apostasy. They left the foundations of their faith. But what they would do is that there's a Christian man in England who purchased Squanto for the sole purpose of getting enough money to send him back to his people in America. When he came back, he found out that the Pequot Indians tribes were wiped out. Plague. Now, he joined the tribe of Massasoit, the chieftain. He befriended the Pilgrims. He showed them how to, plant corn and in that harsh New England environment. He taught them fishing and planting and taught them the various trade craft that were needed to survive. He also told them that God it was believed among the Indians that the Pequots, who would have wiped out the Pilgrims, they didn't care about what the sachems said. They were going to destroy anybody who came on the shores. Plague took them all, except for Squanto, who was gone. That's why the Pilgrims found stores of corn and other goods that had been dried and put in storage, because the tribe was gone. And the Pilgrims settled that land more immediately. Now, it's interesting. The power of what was raised up there in New England, the success of God's protections, how the Pilgrims saved Massasoit's life from disease, how they traded with the Indians and punished anybody who tried to cheat the Indians. Now, that story will go on, has another chapter to it. Unfortunately, that's what happens when people abandon the Word of God. But the Pilgrims were so successful in raising up a colony that many thousands of the Puritans and others came to this new land and established Massachusetts Bay Colony, which later absorbed the small Pilgrim colony. The quality of character that was created, the protection of the people, was noted by the Indians. In fact, the Indians spoke in terms of the gentle rains that nourished the crops of these Puritans. But harsh rains broke their crops. We're only talking a few miles in difference. But it was enough of a regularity that the Indians noted it. The Indians wanted the fellowship and wanted the influence and friendship of the Pilgrims. That's why there was a Thanksgiving. Do you ever wonder why the Indians were there sharing in the feast? It's kind of unique. Name another time in history where the Indians gathered with those in the town, the white settlers, had a big festive time and a feast that became, well, in our terms, later became a holiday. You see, they befriended them, and in fact, missionaries from the Puritans, like David Brainerd, John Eliot, they became missionaries too, men. David Brainerd and John Eliot both referred to the Indians they ministered to and lived among as my people, translating the Algonquin language of the Indians into the phonetics so they could create a Bible. Hence, the village praying Indians would grow up. Later, they would stand with the Pilgrims against King Philip, a man that tried to drive the white settlers back. A series of terror acts gave New England the King Philip's War. But in due time, that all got reversed. The churches were filled with people crying unto God. And the King Philip's War was broken. He was a Spiritist. He and his fellow sachem, they were occultic. They specifically would invoke the spirit world in order to offset the prayers of the Puritans. In fact, a strong tradition you find in New England of various ministers like Solomon Stoddard, like the Reverend Samuel Stone, like, well, David Brainerd, John Eliot, Thomas Hooker. These were men that were known to the Indians, and the story has it that instance after instance, the Indians, when they would rise up against the settlements of the Puritans, would not attack certain churches or certain towns. Statement was that minister of that church in that town, he prays much. He's a great man. The Indians came to admire and fear the power of the settlers. All that's going to change, by the way, by the time 1660 comes around. So we're 40 years down the road from the foundations of the Commonwealth of New England and of Massachusetts. Beginning about 1660, extending for 80 years, was a time of apostasy. That's the time where the churches dwindled in population. People were leaving. The kids were leaving the faith. It's the time of the King Philip's War, by the way, which temporarily reversed that as people cried unto God. But the terror did the trick. The churches were filled for a few short years. Salem witchcraft trials, King Philip's War, and the terror there too. And so much else during that 80 years. that showed a wayward New England. It is in that 80-year period that secular historians like to quote about us not being a Christian-founded nation because there was such rampant compromise in the churches. But the First Church of Hartford, the Reverend Samuel Stone, Reverend Thomas Hooker, who preceded him, these were days in which the churches were admired even by the Indians, by the chiefs, the sachems. All of Europe became aware of the power of Puritan New England. Trade flourished. Crafts flourished. Craftsmanship. Education, well, you be the judge. Harvard was established in 1636, and God made that obviously a great institution. And the other Puritan institutions would be, well, not just Harvard, but Yale, Dartmouth. You're going to find many of these institutions of Puritan origin. Indeed, Cambridge in England. Oxford would be refurbished, made great again by the great Puritan Dr. John Owen, a man revered on both sides of the Atlantic. You might think of him as well, the theological equal of Sir Isaac Newton's scientific prowess, Dr. John Owen. Again, a Puritan. Centers of education grew. The Puritan preacher was a well-educated preacher, and he was not a novice. He was not so worldly or heavenly wise who's no earthly good, you know that expression. That was not the kind of man that they ordained to the ministry. He had to be a man of renown, a man who had already distinguished himself in other areas of life, not just the ministry. Harvard was founded with that in view. Princeton would come along, the same kind of reputation, the same kind of development. The girls in New England, de Tocqueville points out, were the best educated women worldwide. Now we see today there is this presumptuous bias that the women during the, the 16, 17, 1800s in America, New England, along the Atlantic, that the women weren't looked upon favorably for educational purposes. They weren't educated, in other words. Quite the contrary. The Puritans, and I can attest to this personally, I see, having traveled extensively throughout the United States, homeschooling moms and dads, how careful they are that their girls, as well as their boys, be well educated. It isn't that the boys are more important than the girls. That's paganism. No, the girls and the boys get educated. The parents see to both as being well taught. I see that in modern day Christian circles. And that's the description you have of those in New England and elsewhere among the Presbyterians in New Jersey, New York. Theodore Frelinghuysen, the great Presbyterian minister, testifies to that. Jonathan Edwards, the Congregationalist minister, testifies to that. The women were well educated. Now, were they as distinguished? For example, one of the common examples is, they weren't doctors as the men were. Okay, well, then they weren't doctors. But they're the best educated women in the world. And they could, by the time they were of merit, of age to be married, Tocqueville said he was amazed. They were already prepared for marriage. They could handle a business. Their parents saw to it they could handle, for example, a farm. During the War for Independence and in wars prior to that, like the French and Indian War, many men went off to battle, some not coming back, of course. And they left their womenfolk to take care of the family business, a mercantile business, merchants, a farm, or other businesses. You say, well, how can a woman be a blacksmith? Well, there could be, but usually what would happen is that she would hire someone and run it as a business. The womenfolk took over the businesses and ran the businesses. In fact, you find them during the War for Independence. Because of their business abilities, they are networking among themselves to provide clothing, food, and other necessities for the men at Valley Forge under George Washington. They did that all throughout the War for Independence, and they did it in previous wars. Could a woman run a shipping business, a fishing business? Well, fishing, yeah. Shipping was pretty much kept by Great Britain and monopolized by Great Britain, but there are a lot of fishing businesses, business people who are fishermen. They might have a small fleet of ships. Could a woman tackle that? The women didn't prefer to go to sea. But like I said, they could certainly own it and hire it done among the men and were respected in the doing. So during the war, it isn't like a number of dainty women who couldn't do anything suddenly had thrust upon them the necessities of support and backup and provisioning of the men in the field. Quite the contrary. In fact, many women were great shots. They could shoot, they could fire, and did, in fact, fire upon enemies. The Indians testified to that in the French and Indian War. The French testified to it, and the British. That's just one example of the caliber and the character of the people in those areas. That's why de Tocqueville, writing in 1840, admires the American woman. He couldn't express it enough, how thoroughly taught and trained they were, handling business, ready for marriage, could take care of and catechize the children at home. That's a theological catechizing. Could run a farm, all of that and much more. Handled charities, with the backbone of the strength of churches. You see, the point is, the Puritans established something great in the United States, and they did it in England as well. That same theology had an immense effect in France for the longest time among the Huguenots, who migrated to Germany, Denmark, Africa, and, of course, to America. Francis Marion was of that descent. The swamp fox. Satan fears that kind of faith. Those doctrines are missing in most modern expressions of the pulpits today. George Whitefield, when he came to America to preach during the Great Awakening, preached to tens of thousands of people throughout America, the colonial run-up to the War for Independence called the Great Awakening. He said, so many people in the churches are lifeless because dead men preach to them. He's right. It wasn't dead men that were preaching, though, who first came over on the boat. In the English Reformation, that became the colonial Reformation. Later on, 150 years later, the Great Awakening would spring up all throughout the colonies. And it would create our great traditions. You'll see that as we move into the second of these lessons against principalities, powers, and spiritual wickedness in high places. The church makes known to the rulers of this world and makes known the manifest wisdom of God. Being in heavenly body herself, she testifies to the principalities, those that rule, concerning the rule of Jesus Christ, who's the head of the nations. And she testifies of the spiritual battle being waged as we've just described it, as the church becomes the great missionary to the nations. And we are told that kings will fall down and worship the Lord because of her. Queens will nurse her, and rulers will submit themselves to the laws, the precepts, the statutes of God's holy word as taught by the Church of Jesus Christ. I'd encourage you, join us in our next lesson on this particular issue and the power of it in the history of America.
This has been Choke Points Through Time with Dr. Wayne Sedlak. Visit us at visionviewpoint.com, where you'll find a host of articles, books, and videos designed to answer any questions you may have. Join us Tuesdays and Fridays for Choke Points Through Time with Dr. Wayne Sedlak.